Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk through the ideas about motives, emotions, and stress using a real life situation. Um, Motives are why we do what we do. What do we do? Why do we do it? What makes us continue to do something, whatever it is we're doing? Emotions, obviously, things like feeling sad, helpless, hopeless, um, joy, guilt, all those emotions. Where do they come from? What are they? And then, of course, stress, which we'll get into a little bit deeper as we move along here. So today what we're going to do is move back in time, and instead of this being today in 2020, is going to be April 14th, 1912. Some of you may be very familiar with it, some of you may not, but what happened on that date was, of course, the sinking of the Titanic. And what we're going to do is kind of very quickly zoom through some real people that were involved in the Titanic, and we're going to talk about what they did or what they didn't do, and how that relates to some of the terms from this unit. Uh, some of you, or a lot of you, probably have seen the movie, the main movie, The Titanic, the big James Cameron one. Some of you may have seen some of the older ones as well. Um, the James Cameron movie is a very, very good movie. It does, in fact, incorporate a lot of real people. Some of them will be in the slides I'm going to show you. The whole Rose and Jack story is fiction, and the people that were her fiance, her mother, those are fictional characters. But a lot of the other people were real, and a lot of the stories are somewhat accurate. So the people that I'm going to be showing you in this PowerPoint are all real people, real life individuals. And we're just going to kind of briefly talk through them. If you have your term sheet for this chapter, you can see some of the main ideas, this chapter in motives, emotions, and somewhat from stress. All right. This is a couple things just to keep in mind as we talk through this. Obviously, you all know what the ship was. It was sailing from Europe, left England, was coming to New York City, was crossing the North Atlantic in April. It was cold, hits an iceberg. The iceberg ripped open a huge gash along the side, causing the ship to sink in about 2 hours. All right, there were around 2,100 people on the Titanic, and over 2/3 of them were killed. So there were about 700 survivors that managed. Now there's some myths and misconceptions again about some stuff that happened here, or at least some exaggerations. First of all, the whole issue about the class. I mean, everybody knows that there was a class differential on this boat. You had first class passengers who were traveling mainly for motives. Again, why were they there? They thought it was a novelty. It was like a cruise kind of a thing. The Titanic was built as a ship that could never ever ever sink. Today, I don't know if anybody believed that, but they did believe that 100 some years ago. These individuals in the first class were really wealthy. They were coming because they were doing this again for fun. It was a novelty. The third class, what was known as the steerage people, were coming over for a very different reason. They were immigrating. Most of them were coming over here to start a new life. They had all their family, all their possessions, a very different motive. Um, they were lower in the ship. Second class passengers were more middle class people, maybe like most of us, who maybe were there for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of, in the movie, it makes it look like, and a lot of people believe, that the steerage people were purposely kept from being saved. Probably not true. Yes, greater numbers of people died in the steerage, but that was maybe more inadvertent. Keep in mind when the iceberg hit, first of all, or when they hit the iceberg, first of all, there was still this belief, that the ship couldn't sink. Only a handful of people really knew the truth, that the boat was in fact going to go down. They didn't tell everybody that. They didn't want to create a mass panic. The word of mouth to get to lifeboats was done just like that. No PA, no alarm system. So people were just told. First class passengers just got the message sooner. They were up closer to the top of the ship. The stewards who were spreading around the word of getting out and getting your life jackets just got to them first. The people that were lower in the boat, the steerage passengers, a lot of them heard the message later. There were certain pathways that were blocked, but they were always blocked. So I don't know that it was an intentional thing. But also, a lot of them didn't speak English. So they didn't know what was really going on. There was a lot of confusion, which is going to lead to some of when we're, setting the stage for some of the things we're going to talk about here. The other thing people make a big deal out of the chivalry, women and children first, men giving up their seats. I don't know if that's always true. Around the same time, back in early 1900s in Boyertown, huge fire, the Opera House fire, eyewitness stories about men, picking up chairs and hitting women across the head so they could save themselves. I don't know if all men acted chivalrously. Today, probably not. I don't know if people would give up their seats, but anyway, so just some things to think about when we talk about here why people did what they did. We're looking at it now in hindsight. We know what happened, but in the time, in the anxiety and not having accurate information, some of the choices people made were probably not always the best. All right, so let's talk about some of the individuals. All right, there's the ship, of course, going down. All right, so this is Ida Strauss and her husband Isidore. These are very rich people. They were first class. They were actually the family from the Macy's family, so they were very wealthy. Ida Strauss is one of the first ones. Some of the lifeboats, what happens in a big ship like this, I've never been on a cruise, so I don't know firsthand, but apparently on this ship anyway, the lifeboats were loaded in a certain area and then launched to sea, and then another lifeboat would take that place in the area in the ship, and they'd load another one. Some of the early boats, because people were slow in getting to them, were launched half full in an effort to keep things moving. And so anyway, some men did get off in that respect. Ida Strauss was in her 60s, and she gets into a lifeboat. There were some people around her who wanted her husband to go too. And he probably could have done it at that point because the ship was not sinking yet completely. Lifeboat wasn't full. But Isidore decides he's not doing it. I'm a man. I'm not going. I'm staying on the Titanic. Ida decides to get off and stay with him. And they both end up dying. She made some comment like, well, if I've been with him for 40 years, I'm not going to leave him now. So if we think about motives here, why did she do what she did? What would be a reason? I mean, I think you could think of things like maybe just simple love. Maybe she just loved him, wanted to be with him. Guilt. Maybe she would feel guilty if she was saved and he was not. So maybe commitment or loyalty. Those are what we call intrinsic motives. They have to do with something inside of you. All right. Contrary thing is extrinsic. Extrinsic motives are things that are for outside you. So if she did it because she thought she was going to win an award or she was going to get some kind of acclaim for this, that would be an extrinsic motive. In this case, I think probably the motives for what she did were intrinsic. All right, Wallace Hartley, on the other hand, Wallace was the band leader. All right, so Wallace, was told around 11:30, 12 at night, hey, Wallace, get your crap together, get your band, come up here and start playing for the first class passengers. He was not told the ship was sinking. So why does he do what he does? At the beginning here, this is extrinsic. Your boss tells you to do something. You want your job. You want your paycheck. So you do it. So that's what he did. As the ship started to get lower and lower in the water, eventually the captain relieved him of his duties, said, do what you want. Now Wallace decides to stay and play anyway, and so did the rest of his band. This is intrinsic. Why? Maybe he didn't want to go out doing, kicking and screaming, but doing something he loved. Or maybe he thought he was helping. Those would be more intrinsic. At that point, I doubt he was really thinking about his paycheck or following orders. A lot of things we do in life are for both kinds of motives, intrinsic and extrinsic. Hopefully, you're going to school, taking classes for at least to some degree for intrinsic and extrinsic. You want a job, you want to get paid, but you also, I hope, want to do something. You want to do something you feel good about, or do something that gives you some kind of internal satisfaction. Studying for a test, you're doing it just for the grade, that's extrinsic. But if you also like what you're learning and you want to learn, that's intrinsic. All right. There's some other theories about motives here. Bruce Ismay was really the guy who was made out to be more or less the villain of this story. Whatever happened here, he was. What happened with Bruce Ismay is a complicated story. Sorry, I'm kind of stumbling over that one. Bruce Ismay was one of the executives of the White Star Line. And some people think that he had a lot to do with some of the bad decisions, like going too fast and ignoring ice warnings and whatever. Although he wasn't the only one that did that. So to put it all on him is probably wrong. Um, but Bruce Ismay was in an interesting situation. He knew what was going to happen. He knew the boat was going to sink. He did what he was supposed to, help women, children, load lifeboats. Um, Now he's watching a lifeboat being lowered to the ocean. As he's doing that, he sees an empty seat. He looks around. There are no women and children around him to take the seat. So what do you do? All right. There's something called drive reduction theory. This means that we are motivated to fulfill certain drives. A lot of them are biological. You need to eat. That's a drive. It makes you uncomfortable. You're motivated to do something to lessen that anxiety. Um, Needing to survive is a huge motive. So Bruce Ismay has this huge pull to save himself. And what would you do? There's no one around. He took the seat. At that point, I would assume that his anxiety level, at least in terms of dying, feeling the fear of death, is probably decreased. So that's what he does. He ends up surviving, but a lot of people blame him, and he was pretty much ruined professionally because people thought he was a big coward for doing what he did. But I think if you think of it in terms of drive reduction, it makes sense. All right, we want to save ourselves that's such a huge drive, and it makes us uncomfortable. Other people seem to be able to override the discomfort of being scared or being hungry or being whatever we are, and we're motivated to fix something. There were 20 lifeboats that were launched, and a lot of them had empty seats. When the Titanic went down, the majority of people that died from hypothermia, just like the movie portrayed. That meant it took them a while to die. They didn't die immediately. So you're sitting in a lifeboat, imagine that, and you're out there and you hear the screaming, and these people could be your husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. What do? You have room in your boat. Do you go back or don't you? Well, again, there was fear, fear and panic, and they thought that they might die, so most people stayed where they were. But Harold Lowe, one of the crewmen who was in charge of a lifeboat, was the only one who decided to go back. And he took a lifeboat back and looked for survivors. Now, why was he able to do this and none of the others? One reason could be something called arousal theory. This is the idea that some people thrive on that adrenaline rush. Some people like high pressure and stress. Most of us are uncomfortable with that. We do what we can to lower it, to get to what we call homeostasis, to feel better. But some people may actually thrive on that. These are your risk seekers or people that do thrill seekers, things like that. And so Howard Lowe was able to overcome that, went back. Unfortunately, he didn't save too many people, but at least he tried. So there's another reason, his motive to save people, but he was able to, even though that was stressful, he was able to deal with that anxiety and actually go forward with it. All right, when we talk about motives and emotions, emotions, again, are universal. Everybody feels them. Some people are better at hiding them than others. There's also some misconceptions about this. For example, the idea about telling lies. The story went that Captain Smith knew what was going to happen on the Titanic. He knew it was going to sink. But he didn't tell everybody that. All right, there were certain people that were in charge who knew what was going to happen, but not everybody. So there's a scene in the movie where, again, fictional scene, but could have played out in real life. There's a scene where Rose asks him, hey, what the heck's going on here? Is this boat going to go down or not? And he tells her the truth. But in real life, if someone had asked him that, he probably would have lied. So the question is, can you tell a liar? Do you know when someone's lying? And what do you use to make that decision? In this case, I think the circumstances, the context. You saw, if you were looking around and you saw people panicking, and especially if you'd seen the iceberg, you probably knew he was lying. There's some people believe, there's certain things like people shifting their eyes certain ways or whatever they're doing to sell a lie. That's not always accurate. Really the better way is to think about what that person normally does. If all of a sudden they start humming and hawing and shuffling their feet, you could probably believe they might be lying. But it's not as easy as you think to tell lies. Right? Some people are very, very good at covering them up, especially people with antisocial personality disorder, psychopaths can be very good at hiding their lies. Here's a kind of a sad story, well, sad and twisted story, a lot of drama going on the boat. This is Michel Navratil. He was a Frenchman who was estranged from his wife in France and was more or less kidnapping his children. These are his two sons. He put them on the Titanic under different names and was bringing them to America to start over again. When the Titanic hit an iceberg, he's frantic. He's a man. He wasn't being allowed to get on a boat. He had his sons. He speaks French. Most of you probably aren't very fluent in French. If someone was talking to you in French and throwing their kids at you, would you understand what they wanted? Did you know how they felt? Again, you probably be basing it more on the circumstance. The ship is going down and you see him handing you children. But also, I think certain emotions can be seen in people's facial expressions, their gestures, their way they talk. So you probably would be able to feel something about how he felt and understand that, some empathy there. There's another idea called facial feedback hypothesis, which will be on your activity 4. Guggenheim, this is again the only, actually this is, on the left is the real guy. On the right is a picture from the movie. This is the only picture from the film I put in there just because I thought it kind of captured his emotions pretty well. But this story in the movie is close to the truth. Guggenheim was a rich guy, one of the wealthiest people on the boat. He was on there with a mistress who survived. This is a little midlife crisis stuff going on here. He was in his 40s. But the scene in the movie where he has his servant and they decide to dress up and go down like gentlemen, where they're sitting there holding their glasses of sherry or whatever they're drinking, is true. Facial feedback hypothesis is the idea that your facial expressions can actually make you feel certain things, that in a way they trick your brain. Emotions have 3 parts. It has a behavioral aspect, which is what you show. So smiling is behavioral. You put on a happy face. You have the emotional feeling inside, and you have the label that you put on it, the cognitive label. I'm happy, I'm sad. If you label yourself as being brave and you smile and you put that on, act a certain way, that sometimes the muscles in your face can trick your brain into thinking, hey, I'm smiling. I must be happy. I must be brave. I must be okay. Now, whether this worked in his case, I don't know. Maybe the sherry was more effective. But there's some evidence, again, especially maybe in things that are not quite as dramatic as fear of dying, that you can trick your emotions somewhat by putting on that act. All right, some other ideas here when we talk about stress. This was obviously, being on the Titanic was a very stressful situation. You may have thought you were going to die. You were in a life and death scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit more about stress in the next lesson. But when we talk about stress, we're talking about that sympathetic nervous system response, the adrenaline, all right, fight or flight, all right. Another theory regarding stress is something called the GAS, the General Adaptation Syndrome, all right, which means that we go through 3 different stages here. First is what we call alarm. Alarm is really that panicky feeling. Oh my God, what's going to happen? And then we move into what's called resistance. Resistance is doing something about it. All right, so what do we do to fix our problem? And then if nothing works, we call it exhaustion. Alarm, resistance, exhaustion, resigning ourselves. So here's Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was the designer of the Titanic. He, better than anyone, knew what was going to happen. He also was one of the ones who wanted to put enough lifeboats on the boat. There was only enough for half. Why? Well, they didn't think it was going to sink. And putting all those boats crowded the decks. So why do it? Thomas Andrews fought to do that, but he was overruled by the people holding the purse strings. So Thomas Andrews knew what was going to happen. He felt responsible, I believe. And he did exactly what happened in the movie. He went around, he helped people get in boats. But at the end, the last anyone that saw him was standing looking at the clock. So alarm, panic, resistance, doing what he could do, exhaustion, resigning himself that he was going to die. And that's what happened, unfortunately. So that's what happens to us too sometimes. Remember we talked about learned helplessness and the dogs and the shocks. Same thing. At first, imagine people who've been taken hostage, alarm, resistance, trying to do something and then giving up. Making choices. Sometimes, when we can't maybe always fix and change our situation, but we can adjust how we act in it. John Jacob Astor, he was the richest man on the boat. Another guy having a little midlife crisis issue here. He was on the boat with that woman there, his wife. She was only 19. He had divorced his wife, who was in her 40s. He had taken up with this mistress who was 18, got her pregnant, so then ended up marrying her. They were coming across on the Titanic from their honeymoon in Egypt, and believed that dog on there was also on the boat and didn't do so well. All right, when the order came to get into lifeboats, Mrs. Astor was a shoo-in to get into a boat. Okay, she's a young woman, she's pregnant, she's rich, one of the first ones up there, so she's in a lifeboat. John Jacob Astor apparently tried to play the weak woman card. Okay, well, look, my wife is young and pregnant and she needs me, she's too weak by herself. And no, they didn't buy it. And the crew in charge there said, no, you're not going. So John Jacob Astor has a choice. He could have acted like a jerk, like the guy in the movie, where he throwing his money around and trying to bribe his way on, or he could do what he ended up doing. And all eyewitness accounts said that John Jacob Astor stepped up. He went around, he tried to help people get in boats, he did what he could do, and he died on the ship. So I'm sure he felt stress. And again, you have that choice about how to fix it. A lot of times in life, we're confronted with choices like that, and you can make it better, make it worse. But also choices. Sometimes you have to choose between negatives, and there's nothing good about your choice, and they're all stressful. This is what we would call an avoidance type of a choice, when you have to make a choice and neither one is good, or you're making them based on inaccurate or incomplete information. All right, the Hudson Allison story, in my opinion, is maybe one of the saddest ones on this boat. This is one that was not in the movie. All right, so I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but Hudson Allison, the man on the left there, was a first-class passenger. He was traveling there with his wife, his 3-year-old daughter, and his baby son. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, he had servants, and one of the servants was the baby's nurse. And she took this little boy, his name was Trevor, and she got off. She got on a lifeboat and gets off and saves him. Now, she had a bizarre backstory, too. She had apparently been wanted for hurting some kid in Europe or whatever. I don't know all the details there. But she ended up saving the little baby. The problem was that Hudson Allison and his wife didn't know where the baby was. There's no cell phones. There was no way of communicating. In all the chaos, they lost track of the baby. They didn't know where he was. So what do? Now you're stuck, you're Hudson Allison, you're stuck on here with your wife and your 3-year-old daughter. Her name was Lorraine. What do? Do you get in a lifeboat and just hope, fingers crossed, that your son survived and was off already? Which is in fact what happened, but Hudson Allison didn't know that. Or do you stay on the Titanic and start looking for your son? This is kind of a no-win choice. Sometimes you hear the term Sophie's Choice. It's from the movie Sophie's Choice, but with Meryl Streep, set in World War II, where in the movie Meryl Streep has to make a decision. The Nazis make her choose which child is going to live and which child is going to die. All right, it's an impossible choice. Okay, this is what happened here. Now, I think most of us, or a lot of us thinking about this story, would say, well, why didn't he put his wife and daughter in a lifeboat and save them? And he could stay back and look, kind of split the difference kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe Mrs. Allison refused to get in a lifeboat because she would be forced with the same choice, well, which is better? So faced with incomplete info, they decided to stay on the Titanic. And unfortunately, he and his wife and the little girl all died. Lorraine was the only girl from first class, or only child from first class to die. So really horrible story, but making that kind of very stressful. All right, a couple other last things here about stress. This is Frederick Fleet. All right, we're going to talk more when we deal a little bit more with stress, and again, the next topic we'll get to. But we talk about what we call a cognitive appraisal, all right? And a lot of times are dealing with stress. Stress is our perception. That's why some people can take things very differently. If you think about something a little less extreme than the Titanic, but if you think about something like a bad grade, all right, you get a bad grade on a test. A lot of people would find that stressful, but a lot of people wouldn't. Why? It's your perception of it, how you think about it. And this is what we call cognitive appraisal. And we get into cognitive therapy. This is the whole idea around it. How you think about something determines how stressed you are. You think it's the worst thing in the world, you're going to be more stressed than if you can kind of take things in stride. All right, you have to make an appraisal, all right, of how stressful something is and what would be the right course of action. All right, Frederick Fleet was the lookout. And he was the one that was on duty the night they hit the iceberg. He was the one that first saw it and then had to decide what to do. All right, he was at a disadvantage because there were no binoculars in the crow's nest. That was not his fault. Someone else had forgotten them. So he's doing this with a naked eye. Apparently, it was a very calm night, so that made it harder to see icebergs because the waves didn't hit against it as dramatically as they might if the water was choppy. So he sees this thing. He has to make what we call primary cognitive appraisal. First of all, what is it? Is it an iceberg? Is it big? Are we going to hit it? And he decides all of yes, 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 yes. And then what do I do? This is a secondary appraisal. He calls down to the person in charge of steering, and they decided to try to steer around it. Maybe the wrong decision, but at that point, out of Fleet's hands. All right. Now, what happened was Fleet ended up becoming in charge of a lifeboat. He ended up surviving, but he still this whole idea of the Titanic haunted him for decades. I don't think he was at fault. I think he did what he could have done, but it haunted him, and he ended up committing suicide like 40, 50 years later. Now, I'm not saying all his problems were because of the Titanic, but I do think people think it did haunt him. There was a feeling of guilt or responsibility there, rightly or wrongly, and that was part of his perception. On the other hand, in contrast to that, this is Lady Duff Gordon. Lady Duff Gordon was a very rich person. She was in the first lifeboat to be launched with her husband. They only had about 12 people in that boat, could have held at least 50. When the boat went down, the Titanic went down, a lot of people in her lifeboat wanted to go back and try to find survivors. But the story goes that she was really acting kind of like a snoot. She was talking and worrying about all her jewels and fancy things going to the bottom of the ocean, didn't seem to care, that her servants may be dying as well. The story went that she refused to let the little lifeboat go back because she was worried about wrecking her outfit. When they were eventually saved on the rescue boat, the Carpathia, this is the picture that she had taken. She decided to get her people together that were in the lifeboat and have like a kind of a thumbs up, I survived the Titanic picture, which a lot of people on the Carpathia that were surviving, felt was distasteful. Another individual, this is not Lady Duff, but you can see this other woman very upset. Most of the survivors were in shock. They're going through trauma. Most of them had lost people in their families, so they were grieving as well. And a lot of people thought that Lady Duff Gordon was just being, not cool. Why? Why do you think some people react like that? Why? I mean, even today in the stressful, some people step up. Some people act heroically, or at least in an empathetic manner, and not just about themselves. And other people react differently. Why? Is that personality? Is it upbringing? Is it just a defense mechanism? Maybe Lady Gordon was just really scared and that was the only way she knew how to express it. Maybe she felt entitled from her background. But these are, again, reasons, think about the Titanic, a universal stress for 2,100 people. And yet people reacted very differently based on their background, their environment, their temperaments, their personalities, all sorts of things. So when we're talking about motives and emotions, thinking about it in this context of a stress, how would you react? Obviously, we don't know. We're not on the Titanic. Hope we aren't. But it's a way of kind of looking through some of those major reactions to it. All right, next lecture will be a little bit more detail about our specific ways we deal with stress. And that's probably, unfortunately, a little bit very relevant right now. Thank you for listening. Aye, aye.